today on Carolina Week.
I think a lot of it is, kids feel the doom, younger voters feel the doom everywhere.
Nothing resonates with me, nobody resonates with me. I just don't feel extremely represented by anyone right now.
The right to abortion, protecting that's really important, especially for young women.
I, to be honest, don't believe that any of the current politicians hold a plan strong enough.
I think we have the opportunity right now to participate in the most important election in this country.
I bet you if you asked 25% of this campus, they wouldn't even know that there was an election this year.
We've been following the election all semester, on campus and off. Today, a special edition on young voters, the issues that matter to them, and what it will take to get them to the polls in November. Carolina Week starts right now.
From the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, connecting Carolina's campus and community, this is Carolina Week.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of Carolina Week. I'm Lauren Lovett. Today's show is all about young voters, what matters to them, how they feel as we inch towards the election, and how both parties are ramping up their efforts to go after their critical votes. November's election is just 198 days away. In about 6.5 months, more than 100 million Americans are expected to once again turn out to the polls. Let's take a look at the numbers. We have a few. More than 158 million people voted in 2020, the last presidential election. That is 66% of all eligible voters, the highest turnout in the 21st century. 49% of eligible voters voted in the 2018 midterms, the highest turnout for a midterm since 1914. If this year's turnout matches 2020, more than 162 million ballots will be cast. The biggest ticket item on this year's ballot is the presidential race, featuring a rematch between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. While every state votes in the presidential election, only a handful of them will determine the outcomes of the race, as WUNC journalist Jeff Tiberi tells us. Take a listen.
To me, just knee-jerk, the most important and tightest states are Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, in that upper Midwest corridor, Nevada, and Georgia.
But down-ballot races will determine the balance of Congress, where each chamber is held by just a slim margin. 33 Senate seats are up for election. 10 Republicans, 20 Democrats, and 3 independents who caucus with Democrats. From Tim Kaine in Virginia to Bernie Sanders in Vermont and Ted Cruz in Texas. This year's election will determine the balance of a chamber Democrats hold by just one vote. All 435 U.S. seats are up for election. North Carolina currently has a 7-7 split between Democrats and Republicans. But new election maps are expected to give Republicans up to 11 seats. Young voters have the chance to turn the election in North Carolina. A study from UNC found that voters between 18 and 34 are more likely to be unaffiliated than any other age group. Tiberi says that young people would have to buck history to turn this election.
I think theoretically speaking, they could have monumental influence over what happens, right? But history tells us that young people do not vote at the levels, rates of their counterparts in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s.
All 170 seats in the General Assembly will also be on the ballot this November, as well as the governor's mansion and a slew of other positions. CW Christian Phillips is in Raleigh at the General Assembly. Christian, what are the stakes in the state elections this year?
Lauren, the stakes could not be higher. As you mentioned here at the General Assembly, 170 seats are up for election this November. And behind me, in the state capitol, the governor's office is also up for election. Now, Democrats, they need a two-pronged victory for any statewide influence in this election. They need to win the governor's mansion and break the supermajority in either chamber. Currently, Josh Stein is leading Mark Robinson in polls, but it's very close, and obviously, we're a long way until November. Democrats also are more likely to flip the House here, as Republicans only have a one-seat majority. You may remember that came courtesy about this time last year from Tricia Coughlin when she switched parties. Now, besides the important implications of the election in November, we are especially focusing on today's episode about young voters. But what about young candidates? In an election where the two major parties' candidates for president are both hovering around 80, there's been a lot of attention given to the issue of age. But what about on the other side of the issue? Well, here in North Carolina, Wyatt Gables and Jordan Lopez a Republican from Jacksonville and a Democrat from Charlotte, are both projected to easily win their general elections in November. Well, that's nothing too newsworthy there, until I tell you that Lopez is a 25-year-old community leader and Gables is a junior at ECU.
Jordan Lopez's passion for local politics at a young age was aided by a national figure.
When the convention was here in Charlotte, I got to go see President Obama speak. And then hearing President Obama speak was the first moment that it really clicked for me that, hey, that's a Black dude doing something incredibly important in leading our country. Maybe you should try doing something like similar to that one day.
Wyatt Gable got his first taste for politics during high school. Then this past year, when he served as the president of ECU's chapter of Turning Point USA. Then there was the thrill of winning his primary. Gable beat 10-term incumbent George Cleveland.
At first, I didn't really believe it. Sure enough, we checked, so it was a great feeling. You know, I was happy all my hard work and everyone else's hard work that they put in all paid off, so that was awesome. And
both Gable and Lopez agree that the key to reaching voters, young ones in particular, is reaching out and making them feel heard.
you get some weird looks just from door knocking in general, but when they realized it was me, if they wanted to talk, they were kind of surprised. But then once you talk with them and they understand, you know what you're talking about, then all the worries go out the window, and they were all on board. I mean, I definitely think that's where a lot of my voting base came from, because people appreciate you trying to actually get out there and earn their vote, because that's a lost art nowadays.
We've got to do a much better job at reaching out and consistently reaching out. And as far as how to engage, let's just show up. Let's organize events in the community that aren't even solely focused on politics. Of course, there could be and should be a political angle because everything is political, but let's just show up, and then let's keep showing up.
While both agree on what the big problems may be, they do have disagreements on how to solve them.
I know my two big things that I worry about is education, because a lot of the time in high school, I felt like what I was learning is not important to anything. It's just there. You know, you're just not really learning anything that's going to help you in the real world. And then the other big thing, especially right now, is the economy. It's as a college student trying to afford groceries when I go to the grocery store, or gas when I'm trying to go back home. Things like that are big for me, and I know they're big for a lot of other people.
I mean, the most important issues in this election will be public education. Our public schools are in a pretty difficult position right now. What can I do as a legislator to make sure that the kids in my community, the kids in the district that I'll be representing, are receiving the highest quality education that they can get? Or a lot of our educators here are young, and they care a lot about public education. They care about economic opportunity. They care about the state's approach to at least trying to mitigate our effect on the climate. They care about the cost of living, affordable housing being probably chief among them.
And if you don't think that every vote counts, just ask Gable.
I would say take a look at my election. I only won by 95. If 96 more people decided to get out and vote for my opponent, I wouldn't be doing this interview and wouldn't have won the Republican nomination. So it does matter.
Well, as we mentioned, both Gables and Lopez are in very safe districts. So barring any unforeseen circumstances, both will be sworn in here at the General Assembly in January. Lauren, back to you.
Thank you, Christian. There are more elections in North Carolina before November. 3 GOP primaries are heading to second elections on May 14th to decide a Republican candidate. There will be 2 statewide races and 1 congressional race. Hal Weatherman and Jim O'Neill are running for the lieutenant governor position. Jack Clark and David Bullock are running for the state auditor position. And Kelly Daughtry and Brad Knott are running for the U.S. House District 13. Early voting starts on April 25th and ends at 3 p.m. on May 11th. People are eligible to vote if they live in the district that the primaries are held, and they have to be registered in the Republican Party. Unaffiliated voters in the district can also vote if they didn't vote in the first primary or voted Republican. Same-day registration is not available, and new registration for voters is not allowed. However, if you become eligible to vote before May 14th, then you can register that day. Information about where to vote can be found on our website. We're seeing presidential candidates working to win over battleground states like North Carolina. We spent some time talking to a political science professor on campus. She told us candidates like Trump and Biden must focus on battleground states because the votes can go either way. According to Professor Ashley Anderson, it's why candidates are making an effort to visit the swing states. She also said independent candidates could gain traction in swing states, but that is unlikely given the structure of America's two-party system. Former President Trump recently canceled canceled his visit to Wilmington, North Carolina because of bad weather. This would have been his second visit this year. President Biden has visited Raleigh twice this year, once in January and another time in March. Vice President Kamala Harris has visited North Carolina multiple times over the last year. She targeted marginalized youth voters on the Fight for Our Freedoms College tour. Harris visited a total of 9 schools, focusing primarily on Hispanic-serving institutions and HBCUs, including NC-A&T in Greensboro. Harris discussed the power of youth vote as well as new funding for HBCUs and reducing payments on student loans. She also highlighted uncensored education, the right to abortion, gun violence regulation, and combating environmental injustices. The White House said the tour was to, quote, mobilize students and young people in the fight for their rights.
But when you vote, you have the ability to determine the future of our country in a way that might challenge a lot of people's notions about what is possible and who can possibly do it.
The GOP is also working to connect with young voters and marginalized communities. The Republican National Committee's Youth Advisory Council is new this election cycle. The council includes 16 voters under the age of 35 who meet online to share issues about what's most important to them and help mobilize young voters. 5 members did resign in December, however, citing a, quote, lack of organization and communication from the RNC in their letter to former RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel. The RNC also has a larger Republican Party advisory council. RNC Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel says it helped grow Hispanic, Asian, and Black voters in the party in 2022 and will continue that effort. The RNC says this year's council will also target suburban women, young voters, and religious voters, and discuss supporting law enforcement and holding big tech accountable. Candidates are even coming back here to Chapel Hill. Here's what some students had to say after a candidate visited their class.
She did answer some questions, but truthfully, she gave us more unanswered questions than answers to our questions.
Some young voters are feeling left out. Election season brings candidates to college campuses like UNC in droves, searching for the student vote. This strategy helps target educated voters, but may leave young voters who aren't in school saying they feel underrepresented. CW's Chris Williams talks to one young business owner about what it would take to get him more invested in elections.
D'Angelo Perez is 21 years old. He's also the owner of his business, Heritage Welding. With everything it takes to run his business, he says it's difficult to keep up with politics.
Most of the time I'm working, or I just didn't put effort into finding out what is actually going on. So I don't want to vote on something that I don't even know about.
D'Angelo is registered to vote, but he doesn't have a plan for when he arrives to the polls, like the polling place behind me on election day. According to a study from Tufts University, this places him in the same boat as 40% of other young voters who have never enrolled in college and also don't have a plan for who they'll vote for. Still, he says politics have been an important topic in his family because many of his relatives immigrated to the United States.
When my family started to lose their licenses and it started to become an actual factor of like one of my family members could actually get deported or something like that. So it was like something that was constantly discussed and something that was constantly feared.
D'Angelo's mom came to the United States from Mexico before he was born and became a citizen. He says his family's background influences who he considers voting for, but it doesn't cancel out how unheard he feels as a blue-collar worker.
There is like these unions and stuff like that, but those aren't really obtainable for a lot of people. So it's just very difficult for everybody in like the industry to do anything about anything.
In D'Angelo's eyes, the problem is that politicians don't do enough to reach voters like him. According to the same Tufts study, less than 1 out of every 5 young voters can remember a time where campaigns or political parties touched base with them directly.
All I see is posters, all I see is banners, but never like somebody actually trying to like reach out and be like, hey, this is what's going on.
D'Angelo also says he tunes out when debates get too heated. He'd rather decide based on facts, like which candidate's policies would help him provide his employees with decent insurance. He says sifting through what actually matters is the biggest barrier.
How could they reach you in a timely fashion?
Just through the phone or sending an email or just trying to reach out and make it known that like what they're planning on doing, what's going on.
The key, as D'Angelo sees it, meet voters, especially young ones, where they are. In Raleigh, I'm Chris Williams, Carolina Week.
While some young voters feel checked out, others are pushing their fellow young people to get involved. BJ Tillman, a UNC junior and founder of Your Voice, Your Vote, a nonprofit dedicated to increasing young voter registration, says that getting young people to vote is a 24/7 job.
If you, care about like current events and like social justice issues and all those things are tied back to voting.
Is coming from both parties. Aubrey Tuell is the press secretary for NC Young Republicans. She said the organization is using social media platforms like Instagram to reach unaffiliated voters with messages that matter to them.
The fact that they can't afford to buy a home or feed their kids, feed their family, put gas in their car, those are things that I think the unaffiliated population is really going to care about and drive them out to the polls to vote Republican.
While some may view voting in America as an obligation to the country, public policy specialist Anthony Downs disagrees. Downs says voting is irrational, especially in large elections. His argument, the likelihood your vote changes the outcome is close to zero.
You do all this work, you figure out, yeah, that's a candidate who's closer to the kind of things that I believe in, right? And then you say, okay, now I go vote, but what are the chances of you making a difference? I mean, you make a big difference buying this camera. You got this camera rather than another one.
However, Orange County saw a voter turnout of 75% in the 2020 presidential election. So why do people turn out to vote if it's irrational? Bevins argues voting is a form of expression.
It's important for you that you have a voice, and there's something symbolic about it in a way. It's like I'm a citizen, and hereby I show my citizenship, all right? And you want to express yourself, and you say, this is my opinion, and so on. And it's that sort of expressive power that makes it rational again.
Ultimately, the choice to vote is up to you, regardless of the impact it has on the election. Other professors here on campus have been thinking about how the campaigns can get more young people involved. CW's Muhsin Mahmood sat down with UNC professor Shannon McGregor to talk all things youth voter outreach.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm currently joined here with Shannon McGregor, who's an associate professor here at UNC. Shannon, I want to talk to you about the young vote. We've been speaking to people here on campus, and the young people are screaming out here saying that the politicians that they see aren't relatable enough. And so I want to ask you about social media. How do you think social media plays a role in that relatability aspect and how politicians reach young people?
Yeah, so you have to be relatable and authentic to who you really are if you're going to be on social media. If you're anyone, especially if you're a politician. This presents a challenge, especially I think in our presidential race, because the presidential candidates being authentically who they are is not exactly what most young people want, right? So, I think Joe Biden's campaign TikTok has made some pretty funny TikToks, right? Like using the sort of like genres of jokes on there and the sort of memes. But that doesn't make him not an old white guy, right? Which is like one of the things that I think a lot of young people are frustrated with is not only sort of the age of the candidates, but the way that, this is sort of in many people's eyes, right, like a replay of a previous election. But they're, the campaigns are trying to use social media to show like, look, there's other sides, you know what I mean, of these candidates.
We have two candidates which are near enough 80 years old, and one of the things they're going to be trying to do is reach young people through strategies like social media. What impact does it have in terms of the political communication, and what role has it played in previous elections before?
Yeah, so social media has played a huge role in elections before, especially when it was sort of first rolling. Of course, the differences between the candidates are stark here as well. But Obama's campaign in 2008 and again in 2012 really did use social media well to galvanize young people, and then to have young people galvanize other people in their lives, right? So maybe you don't trust politicians, but you trust your friends, you trust your family, right? And so they sort of enlisted people who were supporters, who were young, who could then be the people to reach out. And I think that what are some of the things that the campaigns, both presidential but down ballot too, if they have the finances, are trying to also enlist influencers, right? Even like micro influencers, because those can be still more trusting people that you're following already, who you're used to seeing in your feed or in your timeline. You're going to trust them maybe more than something that would be coming directly from the campaign. So that's another tactic that's sort of advancing, I think, and that a lot of the campaigns are using.
Right. And in terms of the lead up towards this election, what can young people expect to see as the campaigns start to build up and we start to see the two candidates prop themselves up before the young people reach the ballot?
Yeah, so you're going to see a lot of stuff on social media, right? You're going to be seeing more targeted ads. You're going to be getting a lot of texts, right? If you're in any sort of data file anywhere, you're going to be getting texts. And I think we're also going to see campaigns are doing things offline as well, right? They're visiting college campuses. We've seen the Biden-Harris campaign do a lot of visits at college campuses recently. That can galvanize the people at that particular campus, but it's also going to get media coverage, right? That is it's the campaigns trying to show this is a constituency that we care about, that we hear you, and that we're invested in.
Do you think kind of these strategies might be effective for young people?
I think we've seen that they can certainly be effective, especially in terms of just turning people out, right? Like one of the main things about turning people out is just like reminding them that it's happening and reminding them of the stakes of it. I think a lot about the election because this is what I do, both for research and teaching, but it's 6 months away still, right? And so I think we're going to see the tactics really ramp up as we get really in the last 6 weeks or month before the election in November, because that's when people who are not necessarily someone who pay attention to politics all the time are going to really start to be thinking about the election. So we'll see different tactics take a more broad strategy, trying to reach those voters, including young voters, in the run-up to it. But anything they can do to increase turnout, and that includes social media tactics, the campaigns are going to be doing because it is about turnout.
Shannon, thank you so much for joining us and really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you.
Coming up, calls for a ceasefire in the war in Gaza, victims of gun violence, and controversial comments about LGBTQ issues from a gubernatorial candidate. The issues that matter to young voters and how they're defining November's election. Welcome back to this special edition of Carolina Week. New issues have defined this year's 2020 presidential rematch, none among them larger than the war in Gaza. Young people across the country have been calling for a ceasefire in the war. Many of them voted uncommitted in March's primary to protest President Biden's actions. CW's Akshay Gokul talked to young voters right here in our state on how the war in Gaza is affecting their vote.
Meet Jamal Muhammad, a third-generation Palestinian. In recent months, Jamal has been organizing young people at North Carolina State University for Palestine. But this work is not new for him.
I've been to protests since I was like 8. I was really young, 6. And I've seen the oppression since I was young. I've known about it since I was young. Now that I'm older, I'm the president of the Arab Student Organization, so I have a platform to organize.
Throughout the conflict, Biden has supported Israel's right to defend itself. But in recent weeks, the White House has reported that U.S. support for Israel is contingent on an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Earlier this year, however, the administration stated they do not support a permanent ceasefire, which many organizing for Palestine are calling for. The issue of a ceasefire has not only sparked protests, but is also making its way to the ballot box. Across the country, many young voters are expressing disapproval for Biden's lack of support for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza by voting no preference or uncommitted in the Democratic primary. What originally started as a grassroots effort in Michigan by organizers of Listen to Michigan has now become a nationwide movement to mobilize the uncommitted vote. Here in North Carolina, 88,900 people voted no preference in the March 5th Democratic primary.
We're not having it. We want one thing, and that's for you to stop sending our tax dollars to Israel. That's simple. And he hasn't been able to give it to us. He's trying to find ways around.
Nearly 52% of young voters disapprove Biden's performance as president, according to YouGov. And when it comes to policy relating to Gaza, majority of young Americans support a permanent ceasefire. Given this, organizer Hadil Hamoud says that voting Biden is not the answer to the issues the country currently faces.
I think everybody voting no preference understands the consequences if Biden doesn't win, but are finding that the Democratic Party and establishment, and particularly the Biden administration, is not the administration that's going to save us from right-wing fascism and the threats to our democracy that we're facing from the other side of the aisle. So at this point, there would need to be something so drastic from the Biden administration in order for him to convince the young voters that it's worth voting for him.
We are outside Duke-Karsh Alumni Center, one of many polling stations here in North Carolina where young people will turn out in just a couple of months. But who they'll truly turn out for remains a question. 57% of young people say they are dissatisfied with the U.S. political system. 61% say they don't identify with either major political party. And 33% don't plan to engage civically at all in 2024. In North Carolina, young people are increasingly registering as unaffiliated, and voter turnout amongst Gen Z and millennials in the state are lower than any other generation.
Biden currently faces a major challenge with engaging young voters in North Carolina. And in swing states across the country, Biden's pathway to victory relies on the turnout of young people. As of now, Biden's fate remains up in the air as young ceasefire supporters turn to another option on their ballot.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's gonna win in November. I honestly don't think. I think there's so many people who voted for him last election who have just committed themselves not to vote for him. A lot of people are gonna vote for third-party candidates. There's Cornel West, there's Claudia Cruz and Carolina Garcia with the PSL. There's Jill Stein, who have been openly pro-Palestine. And I think people are gonna flock to them, and I think they should. But the fact that we're left with Trump and Biden again, when in 2020 we said, lesser of two evils, got to pick one, or stuff like that, right? The fact that we're left in this position again just proves that the political parties have failed us. That we have two bad candidates that now the only option is to go third party.
Ceasefire supporters are also looking towards other offices to bring about change.
I think I think that the focus really does need to be down the ballot, and I think we should be clear that voting no preference does not mean not voting. And there are a lot of local and congressional elections that are really vital this election, and even here in North Carolina governor election is really important. So that's where my energies will be focused.
Come November, many young voters like Jamal, who may have voted for Biden in 2020, will not see Biden as a viable option for them.
But I did vote Biden, and now I would never vote him again, ever, because of what he's doing. He completely lost the Arab Muslim community vote 100%. There has to be repercussions for what you did. You can't just get away with it, get reelected. If he gets reelected, it's literally a slap in the face to the entire Palestinian community.
In Raleigh, I'm Akshay Gokul reporting for Carolina Week.
The U.S. government continues to aid Israel in its war. The Senate approved a $95 billion aid package for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan last night. President Biden says Israel is under siege and needs U.S. help. The bill now heads to his desk, and he's expected to sign it today. The bill will also force TikTok's Chinese owners to divest from the company or face a U.S. ban. Pro-Palestine protests have spread across multiple college campuses after arrests at Columbia University on Thursday. Students have set up tents and led demonstrations at their universities in support of Palestine. A few of those universities include NYU, Yale, and UNC Chapel Hill. At NYU, the New York Police Department has arrested over 130 people. Statements from these colleges say that protesters were in violation of multiple university rules. Republican candidate for Governor Mark Robinson's past comments about LGBTQ people are expected to have an effect on whether young people will vote for him. CW's Sarah Thompson talked to LGBTQ students at UNC to learn more.
I've seen so much stuff about him, and all of it has been negative. I just don't agree with anything he's really saying.
The impact that it will have if he wins the gubernatorial race is going to be huge.
I kind of think he's
terrible for the state.
Republican candidate for state governor Mark Robinson has said that God made him to fight LGBTQ issues.
There's no reason anybody anywhere in America should be telling any child about transgenderism, homosexuality, any of that filth.
Makes me sick every time I see it when I pass a church that flies that rainbow flag, which is a direct spit in the face to God Almighty.
Robinson is the state's lieutenant governor and first African American